Beijing controls over 90% of the world's supply of rare earth elements used in military technologies. Now, this includes jet fighter magnets, minerals for infrared sensors, drone motors, and precision munitions, among others. Rare earths and other groups of critical minerals are integral for many countries' defense systems and industries. So, what kind of a security threat and geopolitical battlefield is emerging with China's chokehold on the world supply? I'm Divya Gopalan, and you're watching Connected on TaiwanPlus. To discuss the geopolitical risks and the impact of rare earths and other minerals on economies and the defense sector, we are joined by Gracelin Baskaran, Director of the Critical Mineral Security Program at the Washington-based Center for Strategic and International Studies, and she's joining us from Denver, Colorado. Great to have you on the program, Gracelin.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
I'm going to start with a very macro question here. What is the role of critical minerals in modern defense systems, and how much is the need for them likely to grow?
Critical minerals are virtually in every form of defense technologies, from fighter jets, warships, lasers, missiles, tanks. And we need them in large quantities. And what we have seen from China in the last 5 years is they have not only scaled up the production of minerals, but also manufacturing these key critical defense technologies. So what we have now is that China has a stranglehold on the mineral inputs, but also the manufacturing, which has left other countries highly vulnerable.
Okay, speaking of China, let's take a look at some figures here. To understand China's dominance in critical minerals, let's go into these data from the U.S. Geological Survey. It shows that nearly half of the world's rare earth reserves are in China. And in 2023, China accounted for 68% of global rare earth mining, followed by the U.S. and Myanmar, which are both at 11%. Now, China's market dominance is even more pronounced when it comes to refining, with the country refining over 90% of the world's annual output. Now, there's no escaping the fact that China definitely is in control of much of the rare earth supply chains. In April this year, China imposed export restrictions on 7 rare earth elements, as well as magnets used in defense, energy, and the automotive sectors. Now, can you tell us which countries were most affected by that and what kind of a disruption it could inflict on future defense plans or industries?
So on a macro level, almost any country that uses these heavy rare earths were impacted. And that's because the types of heavy rare earths that China targeted were what we call heavy rare earths. You know, earlier when you had those graphs up, what we saw is that China has, about a 90% share, give or take, on rare earth processing. But when it comes to those heavy rare earths, they process over 99% of them. And so what that means is every country on earth relies on buying those separated heavy rare earths from China. Even in the United States, we produce rare earths, but we were sending them to China until earlier this year to separate them. So what that meant is when those rare earth export restrictions went into effect, there was a period where no country could access them. And we saw that whether it was European firms, Japanese firms, or American firms, they were all subject to a supply chain disruption. And for many of these countries, they lacked the reserves to withstand that, and there became disruptions to actually manufacturing.
You've mentioned previously that it is not beyond China to weaponize the rare earth supply chain. Can you explain what that means or what the implications of that are?
So for several years, if we zoom out, we have seen a ramp up of China weaponizing these minerals, going back to June 2023. And it started with minerals like gallium and germanium, which are in semiconductors. Then it moved to graphite, which is particularly pronounced in electric vehicles. Then they started moving to defense minerals like tungsten and rare earths. But what China was doing during this time is working to preserve that dominance in mineral processing. And in December 2023, they actually banned the export of rare earth processing technology. And what this meant is that the world woke up to the fact that it didn't even know how to do it. It wasn't just a money problem, it was a technical know-how problem, and we could no longer source those technologies from China. And that really started the race to accelerate it. Here in the United States, the US government gave out over $400 million through the Defense Production Act to build those rare earth separation technologies. By the time April rolled around this year and the actual the rare earth export restrictions went into effect, it became a global race to find an alternative.
Right. So in light of that, the U.S. Defense Department is trying to establish alternative supply chains, one which is more resilient to any of China's movements, which they call mine to magnet. How's that going?
There has been an unprecedented amount of progress in a short amount of time. So we see that minerals and particularly rare earths have become the mainstay of both domestic policy. So in a very unprecedented move, the US government actually became the biggest shareholder of the only commercial rare earths company here in the United States, MP Materials. We don't normally take equity in companies. But we've also seen that rare earths have become the bedrock of foreign policy. So you saw that during President Trump's first state visit to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, there was not only a MOU signed on a government-to-government level, but there was a private sector MOU signed between MP Materials, the American firm, and Ma'aden, the Saudi Arabian company, where Ma'aden mines the rare earths and MP Materials separates. We've seen rare earths mentioned in Greenland. They've been talked about in Ukraine. They've been talked about in Australia. So rare earths have really become what has been arguably the biggest driver of foreign policy. So it's really an all-of-the-above approach that this administration has been pursuing since the start of the year.
And to drive the point home of China's dominance in this sector, is there any other country that can, in the short term, take over from China with the kind of volumes and the technologies that you mentioned?
Addressing a problem where China has built its dominance over the part of 20 years is not a problem that we're going to solve in 1 year. However, we've seen some really promising starts. So for example, Australian company Lynas began separating heavy rare earths just a few months ago in Malaysia, and we're expected to see that Malaysian facility ramp up. We see that there's been an acceleration of effort here in the United States. We're commissioning our second permanent magnet manufacturing facility. We're going to start separating heavy rare earths here. We see that Saudi Arabia is going to start producing separated heavy rare earths in 2.5 years. So we're not going to be self-sufficient from any of these sources this calendar year or next calendar year. It's going to be a ramp up over a period of about a decade. But what we do know is that, the effort is already being started.
Okay, so steering back to the defense or the risk of that the defense sector is facing at the moment, last year NATO released a list of 12 critical minerals essential to the alliance's defense industry. According to the latest data from the International Energy Agency, China is the largest supplier of 9 of them. Is enough being done to address this? You mentioned, things that are happening very quickly at the moment, but is there a more holistic approach that is happening between countries?
So critical minerals are probably one of the only areas that we're seeing meaningful multilateral cooperation on. I mean, a perfect example of that is the G7. So when it came to the G7, there was a critical minerals statement that came to be that the United States signed on to and the rest of G7. We've also seen critical minerals feature in Quad, right? India, Australia, Japan, the United States. So we've seen, interestingly, that this is one of those few areas of cooperation. And it really will take cooperation. And the reason is this. Minerals are completely dependent on where geology distributed them. Here in the United States, we have less than 1% of the world's cobalt, graphite, nickel. So we can't do better than our geology. So even though we can build a processing facility here, we have to work with other countries that have better geology. So it is really going to be an area that no one country is going to counter China's dominance, given the amount of years they've put into building this absolute advantage, the amount of capital that they have, and the technical know-how. So it really is cooperation.
Well, there is another Asian country that has rich rare earth resources, but it is hamstrung by its instability. So despite having its own production, China imports around 60% of Myanmar's critical mineral output. The Kachin Independence Army, or KIA, a rebel group fighting for autonomy in northern Myanmar's Kachin state, recently seized key rare earth mining hubs, Yangon-based Amara Thiha, a non-resident fellow at the Stimson Center, gives us an overview of Myanmar's complicated rare earth landscape and why Beijing has such a tight hold on it.
Myanmar cannot have a final product, though. The only thing they provide is the kind of clay style, only the very raw format. So if the KIA do not export it to China, and there is no other company that is going to process and buy this up, that's one major issue that I mentioned the first thing. But the second issue is, China is also do not exactly want to depend on the one ethnic group for sure. So after KIA using rare earths and leverage, and after United States show interest to engage with KIA and different lobbying from trying to engage with KIA, China may be thinking for other strategic hedging or trying to have a risk mitigation system. So they may explore the rare earth in other areas where you can find in the southern Shan state, central Myanmar, and also in the southern Myanmar part. And then there will be a lot of potential for exploration there too. So China will also try to mitigate the risk by looking at another exploration. And the third one is even though the KIA stop exporting to China, and the only issue is these rare earths require other rare earths, other critical elements to become an alloy in the specific some form of final product. This make the production cost will be a bit higher, but it will not necessarily disrupt the whole supply chain.
Gracelin, recent reports indicate that the Trump administration may make a move to secure rare earths from Myanmar. But given the murky political situation there, the instability there, what would that entail and how likely is that?
Myanmar is a very hard place to do business. And remember, a government-to-government cooperation can create an enabling environment for the private sector. But the private sector ultimately is the entity that has to go in and mine it. Even when we look at a place like Ukraine, there was a reconstruction agreement reached earlier this year. But given the volatility from neighboring Russia, we haven't seen a surge of investments being made. As we've already seen in Myanmar, it is very easy for a rebel group or a militia to go in and take a mine. And no company really wants to go in and work on a $500 million to $1 billion investment with the risk that could be expropriated so easily. So while there are efforts on kind of a bilateral government to government level, it is very unlikely at this point that the private sector will want to run in there and make an investment given the ongoing security risk in a place like Myanmar.
And speaking of very uncertain, possibly risky environments, the Democratic Republic of Congo has sizable reserves also. And in fact, the country's current conflict is driven by control over those resources, those rich mineral resources. So in June, the U.S. brokered a peace deal between Rwanda and the DRC with the promise of U.S. access to DRC's minerals and rare earth reserves in exchange for regional security. Now, given what you've just said, how realistic is that?
They're quite different contexts. So I would tee up the DRC this way. The DRC historically has been a hub for Western mining companies. 20 years ago, Rio Tinto, BHP, Anglo American, Freeport, number of other companies operated quite successfully in the DRC. And there are parts of the DRC that are quite stable. What we call the Copper Belt, which is home to the Libido Corridor in Katanga, is a very stable area. Now, the DRC has challenges with doing business. A lot of them are related to fiscal, tax, legal, corruption. And that is really what this administration in the US is looking to address, is can we make some of those reforms to incentivize mining companies to go back? You have to realize, what's so appealing about the DRC is that its minerals are absolutely incredible, right? You're talking about the two biggest copper deposits in the world in terms of actually the quality of the ore grade, 11 times the global average of what you see in the 20 biggest mines in the world. You're talking about half the world's cobalt, lithium, nickel. So companies have mined there historically because the geology outweighs the risk. Now, with this current deal, we've already seen that the private sector is looking, but they do need to make some reforms. So it could be mutually beneficial. Now, the T's and C's of that are currently being worked out, but it has historically been a place where Western companies have operated.
Right, and the African continent has also been a place where Chinese companies have operated thanks to the Belt and Road Initiative. China's snapped up mineral rights throughout Africa and other resource-rich locales. Are other countries coming in a little bit too late in the game?
China is a few decades ahead of many Western countries in Africa. As you said, they have the Belt and Road Initiative, so they've invested in the entire mining ecosystem, not just the mine, but the transportation infrastructure, the energy. Now, the one thing that really works in the favor of the US and Western allies is that increasingly countries don't want to have one source of investment in one source of offtake. As we well know, the Chinese economy is facing structural risks. And a lot of the way they're approaching, we've seen the Chinese president shift to what he calls small but beautiful. And as demand in China is wavering, having one source of offtake is a risk. So we've increasingly seen African countries look to diversify their partners. And that's not just the US or Australia, it's also the Gulf. We're seeing countries like the UAE and Saudi Arabia playing bigger in Africa. So now what's happening is we're seeing competition in Africa, which is actually allowing African countries to get a better deal for their resources. And we've seen a lot of headway since January between the US and Africa. The entire bilateral engagement strategy has really shifted from one that is historically aid-based and national security-based to one that is really minerals diplomacy-based. So beyond the DRC and Rwanda, we've seen active, state visits from the heads of state of 5 African countries like Mauritania and Gabon. We've also seen Guinea be quite active and send a delegation to the US. So quite a few African countries are courting relationships. And, the transactional approach for some African countries is actually quite appealing because they know what they're going to get in response to being able to provide those minerals.